There we go. That's on. Oh, too loud. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tau Centre for Digital Journalism. I'm Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tau Centre. There is no more greater pleasure than launching or talking about a really fantastic piece of work that has come out of the Tau Centre that you've had almost absolutely nothing to do with, because it means that, first of all, that you have brilliant people coming and working here, which we do, and secondly, that you have a team who can deliver great events like this and you don't have to worry about them too much. So welcome to our event for launching Audience Revenue and Engagement, which has been a fabulous project produced by Emily Goligoski and Elizabeth Hansen, who is a Tau Fellow, and now she's going to be a Shorenstein Fellow, so we have all the fellows. And Emily Goligoski was leading the membership. I want to call it membership puzzle, but yeah, okay, so the membership puzzle project, which actually means that we've also been working with NYU as well, and Jay Rosen has been working with the Correspondent team who were looking at these new models. And I think kind of Jay and I had a conversation about this maybe a year ago, maybe more than a year ago, and we both had this, it's really interesting, but we're not sure, you know, if we had to privately give this a success, you know, this model, would we give it more than 50% or do we give it more than 60%? Well, you know, neither of us were, even though we were willing the idea of membership to be successful, and my background's at The Guardian, we wouldn't have given it like a high degree of success. Now, one of the great surprises of the last 2 years is people's willingness to pay for journalism and pay for it in different ways and to prove me and Jay wrong, which is always a good thing. The other thing to say is that it's not easy. It is a business model. And this piece of work is just amazing. It was described as 42 mic drops for the industry by the Coral Project, because it's got really hard recommendations for you guys, if you're involved in the industry, to adopt. And that will really help you. And there's no better, I think, kind of endorsement for research than to say, you can read this, you can kind of distribute it around your newsrooms or your network, and this will actually help you. So thank you very much indeed for coming. Thanks very much indeed to all of the sponsors that supported it. There's a long list of them that are in here. I will leave it to Emily and Elizabeth, who have better memories than I, because they're both much younger, to recite who those are. But I also want to say thank you, research team, because this is an amazing piece of work, and we're really proud of it, and we're very pleased to have been a small part of helping it see the light of day. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the creators of the report.
Thank you, Emily. So I'm glad that that Emily fessed up to her skepticism, because I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit of context for why we think this report constituted mic drops, by saying, why is this important now? And the first reason that we believe is that it's pretty clear that the traditional ad-based model for supporting journalism is broken, and I want to flash up two fairly shocking graphs here. One shows the very precipitous drop in newspaper revenue and the equally precipitous increase in Google and Facebook revenue. This will be familiar to many of you. But perhaps less familiar is this amazing analysis by Traffic Magazine on how many impressions it takes to fund one journalist for 1 year. And all the way on the left, you can see direct sale advertising. So those impressions are in the 1 to 2 million range. All the way on the right, you see mobile banner ads, global, at 13 cents CPM, and that is 530 million impressions. So this, above all else, should convince us that an ad-supported model for news is not a thing anymore. The other reason why we think it's so important to have this conversation now has to do with some of the research that we've been doing here at the Tau Center on the relationship between platforms and publishers. And the takeaway from that is that this third-party distribution landscape is incredibly complicated. This is an analysis by Tau's own Pete Brown that has tracked the publisher posting behavior for 1 year across 16 platforms. And if you just take a minute to think about the amount of organizational activity in a newsroom that it takes to sustain this level of distribution, it's amazing. And this is, of course, when we published this here at Tau, my favorite tweet, Jessica Lesson saying, "This is everything that was wrong with journalism in one chart." But of course, now in the last month, we know that the platforms themselves are a little bit ambivalent about this news business, and we've seen Facebook, again, tweak its algorithm, this time deprioritizing publisher content. So we really see the pendulum swinging back now to direct audience revenue. This has been in the headlines in the last week. The New York Times yesterday just announced they have an amazing 2.6 million digital subscribers and bring in $1 billion of subscription revenue. And so that's the context in which we want to have this conversation and share our findings, because we think it's a really important moment for what we have to say. So I'm just going to pass to Emily to talk about the history of this project. Go ahead.
Sure. First of all, to Tau and to Institute for Nonprofit News, thanks so much for having us and for your involvement in this long-term project. Elizabeth kicked this work off about 3 years ago with support from INN and started conducting some interviews on her own. When Membership Puzzle Project was institutionalized now about 8 months ago, a few people had recommended that we would be a winning team, and 10,000 Slack messages later, we now have the book that you hold in your hands. I wanted to make a quick note just about the research methods. So our project based at NYU is heavily influenced by qualitative research. And the bulk of this work has been in talking to about staff at 300 different news sites around the world to understand what works, what they want to change, and what terrifies them. To look at spaces beyond the news industry, to think about where we can seek alternate sources of influence. And finally, in talking to supporters of news around the world to understand what they want from their side of the social contract. So we're really eager to identify places where each side, publishers and members of news, feel like they're getting the better end of the deal, and we think that's a really solid path forward.
So before we dive into the findings, this report is a little bit of an interesting hybrid. So we have a set of research findings from all of our interviews and observations. And then there's a piece of this report that we feel like is really field building, where we're trying to say, here's a set of terms and a glossary that we think it would behoove all of us to try to understand and get on the same page about. And we see this particularly in relationship to these revenue models as a whole. So donation, subscription, membership. And I want to take just a minute to talk about how we came to understand these terms and what we think they mean about the audience revenue space. So donation we see as really a traditional nonprofit fundraising model, where you're asking your audience to give time or money in support of a common cause or values. So that's a very traditional charitable relationship. Then on the other side, like subscription entails some kind of gate around the content, some kind of payment for access, and is at heart a more transactional relationship. And then we really see this third area of membership and the work that the Membership Puzzle is doing as trying to get at a different kind of relationship between publishers and their audiences that's more of a two-way exchange of, money, time, connections, expertise. That's kind of a thicker relationship than either the donation or the subscription. So that's how we are mapping the space as we approach these questions.
That's right. Sort of related but distinctly different models that can work in tandem.
Okay, so some of our key findings. So the first is that audience revenue, direct audience revenue, we found is really just a piece of the business model puzzle for news. So it's not a silver bullet. It's been rare for us to see any more than 20 to 30% of revenue from direct audience max. Day Correspondent is amazing and has, 100?
85% and growing.
Percent and growing, but that is like an incredible outlier from what we've seen. And the second is that subscription, so that's in the membership and donation space. Subscription, we found, really works best for very highly differentiated market-related information. So if you think about The Information or The Blast, which is a premium product newsletter that the Texas Tribune publishes, they're really related to, it's almost like trade information, and they can charge premium prices for that. The other finding is that building a membership program, because it entails building this two-way knowledge exchange, really takes an incredible amount of time and effort from everyone on the staff. It's not something that you can just say to the business side of the house, like, go build a membership program. When it works well, it really is a 360-degree incredible amount of effort from everyone.
And Day Correspondent, which you'll hear from in a few minutes, is a great example of that, where they've written into their reporters' job descriptions the expectation that those individual reporters spend anywhere from a third to half of their time in close collaboration with their individual knowledge communities. So the idea that it isn't just, we hit publish and then you can access our work, but actually we want to encourage you to be involved in it in a substantive way well before publication.
So the other interesting finding is that building a direct audience revenue stream really takes a muscle on the part of publishers to be able to articulate and tell their own stories. So the values of the publication and where they come from. I learned this is a very early finding in my research with the Voice of San Diego, talking about how they built their membership program from scratch by actually going out into the community and saying, what do you value about us? What's distinctive about us? And then coming back and being able to say, okay, so what does that mean about what we stand for, what our values are, and then how do we integrate that into every piece of both our membership program and our coverage? And when this works really well, what we can see is that, further down the conversion funnel, publications can actually use that language and that relationship to really be transparent and ask for support in a way that's incredibly powerful. So this is an example that we have in the report of Mother Jones fundraising articles, where they talk about how much it takes, how much money and time it takes to do the work, and how much they need support for it. So the bulk of the report is organized around the idea of an audience funnel. And we did this because we really see the funnel as a great way of bringing together engagement and revenue in kind of a single map. So we talk about it as going all the way from user research, which is really understanding who it is out there and what they want, through building attracting an audience, engaging and deepening the relationship with them, converting them, and then sustaining the relationship after they've become donors or members. So related to that, and we're sort of seeing this everywhere at the moment, email seems to be, again, having a moment in the sun. It is a really powerful engagement and revenue tool. It's part of everyone's daily habit. I'm sure you all have email habits. I know I do. It really meets audiences where they are. And in this moment of social distribution, it's not a platform that's owned by a third party. So if you can find your way into your audience's email inbox and find your way into a daily habit, it's really powerful relationship and ultimately revenue-raising tool. And we see also the data from newspapers that they are now finding that email newsletter subscribers are more likely to convert to paying subscribers. So it's working in both models.
And with apologies to people in the tote bag business, we found that, surprise, it's not as much of a driver as publishers might hope. How we found this, we have gone to news sites all over the world, and in talking to their supporters, put the question to them of what do you value and what is worthy of your time, your participation, your money? These are some of the things that we've asked about. And we've had very highly consistent findings across cultures. So some of the things that have really resonated in what people tell us they care about and they value in the organizations they choose to support include unique value above all. The idea that this site publishes coverage that I can't find anywhere else. Process transparency. I have a clear sense of who I can contact if I have a tip or an idea, and I understand who the people who make the site run are. a simple user experience, something, as one user told us, something that doesn't make me feel like I'm a child, something that makes me feel like you're making good use of my attention. And finally, worthwhile exchange of time, money, and ideas. We heard over and over again the importance of a sense of shared responsibility. I expect you to deliver groundbreaking reporting and stories that aren't being published elsewhere. In exchange, you will find I have inexhaustible energy for the work that you do if you just find the right ways to engage my attention. We similarly heard high consistency in the things that people value a lot less. So the first is the swag. And, you know, it can be a great bonus gift or sort of a sign-on gift, a nudge to get people to sign on, but ends up, you know, 9 out of the 10 people we talk to will say, actually, I would much prefer that you put that money back into the journalism itself, as opposed to whatever it is that you might ship me with your logo. And then finally, a sense of exclusivity. So I went into this work expecting that people would say, no, I actually really want to feel like a VIP. And I've been pretty surprised by the extent to which we've heard, I don't want to be part of a walled garden. I actually want the core news product to be open and accessible to more people. And I think it's really important that the news industry hear this in a moment where we're having paywall and meter fever. The idea that actually by being more inclusive, inviting more people to experience our coverage, and then having some additive features on the side, members-only gatherings, opportunities to connect with staff, et cetera, just can feel more like the icing on the cake and doesn't need to be quite so gated. We have more work to do to understand ideal contracts between the needs of publishers and members, but we think that audience-driven exchange is really a key part of what this will look like for the future of news sites, no matter what the areas they cover are.
So the last finding, and I think in some ways the most important, is that this all requires a tremendous culture change in the profession and in these publishers. So, and I think that happens along 2 dimensions. One is that this kind of an integrated audience, revenue, and engagement model requires collaboration between the business side and the editorial side that historically we haven't seen inside of publishers. So that's one hurdle. And then the other is that this two-way relationship between journalists and their audience is also like a new muscle for the profession. And so both of those things mean that actually executing on a member donor strategy requires high-level buy-in from the leadership and really being able to like show the way for how this works and encouraging different parts of the organization to work together and encouraging the whole organization to think about its relationship to the audience differently. So I just want to end with a couple of surprises for us as we reflected on our findings. So the first is that reasonably priced, high-quality technical tools and the organizational capacity to use them to support these kind of integrated revenue and engagement strategies are pretty nascent. So the News Revenue Hub does an amazing job and is doing an amazing job of building up this space. So there are tools out there, but scaling them, finding the money to scale them, and really helping the organizations use them in the most optimal ways is an ongoing challenge, and that was a surprise to us. The other is that there really is confusion in the field, we think, between donation versus subscription versus membership. And on the one hand, it's sort of like, well, okay, that's fine. We're all kind of talking about the same thing. But on the other hand, I think if you listen closely to what we're saying, this choice about how closely engaged you want to be with your audience and how much organizational work it takes to do that means that it should really be a conscious choice and a strategy. And it's not for everyone, but when there's confusion about terms, it just makes it all that much harder for people to share best practices because people say they're doing the same things when actually they're doing very different things. And to Emily's point about the social contract, we're seeing really high variation as people are experimenting with what this means for them and the relationship between publishers and audiences, which is great, but is also adding to confusion. And finally, we really feel like this is a new field of practice. And we're really excited by the organizations that are working in this space, that are trying to bring publishers together to share what they're learning, to kind of bring them up the engagement curve. And we think that's where a lot of fruitful collaboration and learning is going to happen.
And with that, I'd like to invite my esteemed guests to the stage. The idea being that they're going to share with you a little bit about what has worked, what's keeping them up at night in this space. So give us just a moment. Happy Friday, everybody. To my very far left, we have Ernst Poef, co-founder and publisher of Day Correspondent, an Amsterdam-based for-profit journalism platform supported by 60,000 members. I've had the benefit of studying their newsroom and members as part of our work for the Membership Puzzle Project, of which Day Correspondent is a founding partner. Next to him, Kate Myers, Executive Director of Revenue and Operations for FirstLooks Media, which is a nonprofit devoted to adversarial journalism in defense of the First Amendment. Kate is developing the revenue strategy and business operations for the Intercept, Field of Vision, and the Press Freedom Defense and Grants Fund. Next to her, we have Sue Cross, Executive Director and CEO for the Institute for Nonprofit News, an organization of over 100 nonprofit media organizations in North America, which shares its practices, collaborates on stories, pools resources, and offers training in professional, organizational, and business development, and for whom our industry has benefited greatly. And finally, Harry Backlund, Director of Operations for City Bureau, a nonprofit civil journalism lab and teaching newsroom on the south side of Chicago. Elizabeth and I have asked these four to come together because they really represent some of the smartest practices and really well-honed ideas about how to bring this work to the world. And so what I've asked them to share with you today is some of the rationale for undertaking their work, success stories, what's worked, and to give you a sort of a vivid sense of where are places where this is really coming together nicely around the world, and ongoing challenges. I'll try to keep my questions moving so that we can hear more from you. But first, what I would like to ask this group, and maybe I'll start with Harry to my left, is why did City Bureau actually choose to pursue direct revenue?
Sure. Thanks very much, Emily, and thanks everybody for being here. I think before I can answer that question, I have to just really quickly explain what City Bureau does and is, because I think we have a unique perspective on some of these membership questions for a few reasons. But one is that we are not a media outlet currently. We call ourselves a civic media lab, and when we started, it was really to test some different kinds of practices, particularly around production, like how could local media be made differently, how could it engage people differently, and I'll give just a quick one-line summary of our programs. We run a fellowship program which trains kind of emerging journalists, and the focus is really on people who are not represented in newsrooms. We run we call it the Documenters program, where we train and then pay citizens, anybody who wants to show up for trainings, to cover public meetings and parse public documents. And then our last program is the Public Newsroom. So every Thursday evening in our newsroom on the south side, we kick the door open and we have a public workshop or discussion. Another thing that's unique about our work, we're very, very place-based. We're rooted in Chicago. In particular, we are born out of a response to racial segregation in Chicago. Racial equity is at the foundation of our work. So all of that, when we thought about what it meant to start a membership program, some of them were strategic questions. We were thinking about revenue to some extent. We were thinking about kind of long-term sustainability, but we were also asking some kind of existential questions about the relationships between journalists and audiences and whether that is even the right frame anymore. Our long-term vision for City Bureau is an organization that's supported by the public, where a lot of people are contributing to it, and also paying out to the public, where a lot of people are participating in the work. So I think the other thing I should say is we are different also from colleagues on this stage because we're so new and so young, and I would definitely challenge the idea that our membership practices are well honed, because we knew going in that we were going to go quickly to the public with a rough draft of what we thought it could mean to be a part of this work, and that we would evolve that idea in public with the members that decided to sign on to this. So if you go to our membership page and look at our program, it is very much a rough draft. We intentionally threw the labels bronze, silver, and gold on there because they are familiar to people, people know what they mean, and we think that will give us some space to kind of, over time, evolve what this will really be with our supporters.
I think it's an important the commitment to openness there, to say, help us co-design this, is something that is fantastically rare, and I really do want to point out there.
You want me to go next, or you going?
Let's have you tell a little bit, if you can. Just so Sue is able to bring us sort of a landscape level view in working with more than 100 different organizations who have been at this just about longer than anyone.
Well, it's interesting. They fall in two camps. We have about 150 nonprofit news organizations around the country. So roughly, very roughly, about a third local, about a third state and regional, about a third national and global, all based in the U.S., and about a third across all of those cover a specific issue or topic. So that's kind of the mix. They fall in membership, I think, in kind of two generations is how I think of it. There are many that started as intense investigative organizations. That's our core of our membership, and they were entirely grant funded for the most part, and then build up other things. And a lot of those are kind of retrofitting is what I'd say, right? They're looking at your work and other things, and that was the origin of this study, was one of those organizations saying, where do we go with this? We've never done this. What could we apply? So that's a whole generation. Then there's another whole generation that is starting here. And City Bureau is one of the most community-centered, but they're all rooted in the community, and they tend to start with this very deep level of community involvement. So the membership maybe grows a little easier or more naturally there because you're starting there. But both of them are progressing very well. We just got through the end of year News Match campaign, which was sponsored by Knight and Democracy Fund and MacArthur, among many other smaller foundations. So that's building the capacity across all these organizations in reaching out to the community and specifically to build individual donors. And many of them are doing it well and have been doing it for years, and then others are just thrilled. They've never gone out and asked the community to support them, and they're seeing great results. I mean, it's very effective, and they are able to raise that support in new ways. So that's kind of what we see across the landscape. The challenges, I think there are some inherent personality kind of things that come up, particularly when you're talking about investigative journalists, and when you're saying this takes the newsroom as well as the business side. You know, investigative journalists aren't out there schmoozing generally. It's not those personality types and being the big community connector. You're laughing. You can talk about this much more. And it's not that they don't get it or want to do it, but they're inherently kind of roles that don't fit together very well. So I think it's a little bit of an added challenge for hard news newsrooms just because of human nature, really. And not necessarily just because they're covering harder news. The public does seem to engage around harder news a lot. on that. And then the other thing that comes up is that it is, as you guys alluded, it is a ton of work. So it's not just something you do for a few hours here and there. It is a major commitment of the whole organization. Our organizations, even the larger ones, are small relative to the whole world of media. So you can't do it lightly. You have to pick, are you really, where are you really going to invest your time to try to support this journalism? And they have to make really hard decisions. So I think that's the other key thing we see across the field.
The idea that this is one revenue stream that may sit along a live events strategy, any advertising that they do, et cetera. And I think that point that this is not a campaign and it can't just be turned on and off. It's a long-term commitment that you build into part of your organizational DNA.
The other thing that I think we see that's fairly, that's ingrained for the larger and older organizations, but most of the younger ones are early in the evolution, is that a section of your membership efforts or reader revenue efforts tend to evolve to major donor relationships, and those generally are accepted as having the highest return on the investment of your time and money, but they can take 3 to 4 years to build up. So this is kind of an early stage, and then some parts of it will go to that, but most of them aren't seeing a huge return on that yet.
And from Kate's work now with the Intercept, but also previously in her work with National Public Radio, I think has a lot to add on this.
Yeah, just coming to the Emily, when she introduced me, talked about the mission of First Look as being out there to live and practice and defend the First Amendment. That's actually only half of the mission as to why First Look was founded. As we founded that, as that organization was founded to kind of house that adversarial journalism, one of the things that was recognized at that founding was in order to make that journalism have a home, there was no way it was going to be fully commercially viable. So the question was, what do we build around it in order to keep that organization, to have that organization be able to do the kind of fierce adversarial pain in the ass work that it does, while not being dependent on one particular founder or one particular revenue stream or one particular path. So when First Look was founded a little over 4 years ago now, we were blessed and in a hugely privileged position to spend the first 3 years of First Look's founding not having to worry about going out and hunting down those donors or those foundation donors, because we have one very generous founder who is committed to that mission and is committed to building an organization to allow the journalism we do to be independent. I joined First Look a year ago as we move into that next phase. How do we move, now that we've established the Intercept, now that we've established Field of Vision, now that we've established some of our efforts, how do we move into building that independent model that can house the kind of fierce adversarial journalism that our audience has come to know and expect from us? So we're about, 9 months into our membership program. When I joined a little more than a year ago, I joined 10 days after the inauguration. So I knew that I launched the membership program at day 106 of my administration, which I felt like I got a lot done in those first couple months. But when I was choosing, when I came in to decide how we were going to earn some of our own support on the nonprofit side for First Look, membership was the membership, and specifically membership for the Intercept, was the thing that made the most sense. Not just because it was 2017 and we all lived through last year, so we know what that was like, but also because the Intercept was already founded on having a set of journalists who were already in that active conversation and already engaging with the audience, and already had a core group of people on our email list and in our audience that cared deeply about what we did. When we asked the questions as to what people valued about the Intercept, more than 80% of them said, I know that what you guys produce can't be found anywhere else. And so when that was one of the key reasons that we knew membership was going to work for us, and we were very happy in our first year, helped by Mary Brown and those at News Revenue Hub, to get our membership program out into the market and to we didn't quite hit 10,000 by the end of 2017, but certainly by the end of January, we had over 10,000 people who had chosen to give us money, which was 50%, 50 to 100% more than I thought we were going to get in our first year. And I think what we are, so we've been very successful, and we've been very happy, I should say, with the success that we found in our first year of taking that core part of the audience that cares so deeply about the Intercept and wanting to give back to it and to wanting to be part of the work that we do. And that's one of the reasons, that's our base rationale for why the Intercept and then in our Intercepted program have launched. We will look at, as we look sort of ahead to the future, we're looking to see how we translate that both into keeping and deepening the engagement with the members that we have, as well as launching them for some of our other programs and products, and finding out or going out to see, is this going to work for Field Division, which may have a different relationship with its audience, or for our efforts in Brazil, which has a very different culture when we talk about membership and fundraising. So we have a lot more to learn and a lot more to grow, but we've been very happy with our nascent efforts here.
And I think it's an important lesson also in audience segmentation and not having this idea that there's there's one audience who we're trying to reach, but actually to be more inquisitive about the different communities you're trying to serve with various editorial products. Quickly, hi Ernst.
Hi.
I would like you to talk a little bit about the inception of Day Correspondent,
Sure.
and also the expansion now to the US, because I think it's such a great example of bringing membership more closely and sort of redesigning what a audience-funded site might look like.
Yeah, so we picked reader revenue because we didn't want to be dependent on advertisers and investors. So Rob, who's on the front row here, please wave, Rob, who's the editor-in-chief and the founder, and I worked both at a newspaper called NRC in the Netherlands, which is a great newspaper, but they had advertising, and they were, by the time, back then, owned by a private equity firm. And we noticed that the advertising influenced the journalism, not so much that, it was a Chinese wall, but there would be like news sections in the newspaper, like a career section or a travel section. And the only reason they added those sections to either their side of the paper was because it's easy to sell advertising next to it. It wasn't because the readers asked for it, for example. And also we noticed that the investors just kept on raising the profit expectations, which hurt the journalism as well. So when Rob got fired and my project got killed, we figured, let's do something for our own. And and from the get-go, we knew we wanted to be dependent on just readers. So Rob wrote 10 founding principles, and Harold, who's sitting beside him, who's also one of the co-founders, designed a beautiful crowdfunding site and the whole brand, which we called The Correspondent. And we basically said, if you agree to these founding principles, and if you think you need this in your daily lives, we presented ourselves as a daily antidote to the news grind. If you think you need that, then please give us 60 euros, which is around $70. And if we find 15,000 people who are willing to do that, we have enough money to get started. And to our astonishment, we reached that goal within a week. And after a month, we had 20,000 backers, and we could launch. So that was in 2013. And now we have 60,000 paying members. And 85% of our revenue comes from readers, either through the membership, which is the biggest chunk, and also some books that we sell. We have our own book publishing, which we also sell directly to readers. And one of the key things that we're doing is that we're not just asking for people's money, but we're also asking them for their knowledge. So we believe that our readers know more than we do. Because we're with 45 people in the newsroom, but we have 60,000 members, so they know more than we do. And we see our readership as a network of sources. So every time a journalist has a new idea for a project or a series, then we share our story idea and we ask, for example, if we cover bureaucracy in healthcare, we ask our membership, are you a doctor? Are you a patient? Are you working at a hospital? And do you have experiences with bureaucracy in healthcare? And they share that knowledge with us, and we use that for better reporting, but also to So it improves the journalism, but it's also good for the business side because if someone is really engaged in our journalism, that also means that the chance that they're going to renew their membership is also bigger. So we don't really recognize the problem of business people and journalist people not being able to work together because they have the same incentives, because we're just dependent on reader revenue. The other 15% of our revenue is either some grants, so that's 10% of our revenue, and then we have also a speakers agency, and we organize some events. So that's how we come up with the rest of the 15%. And now we want to expand to the English language, and we moved to New York to do that. We picked the US as our home market because we don't cover the news. We try to be an antidote to the news grind. So we cover structural developments because news is always about the exception, and we rather write about the rule. So we don't cover the weather, we try to cover the climate. And we do that together with our readers. So if you're covering a lot of global developments, it makes sense to involve as many people as possible in that journalism. So that's why, from the start, we always wanted to have an international version. And when I was at Jay Rosen's class at NYU, I think 2 years ago now, pre-Trump, one of the students asked, "Do you have international ambitions?" And I said, "Yes." And then Jay said, "We should talk." And so the next morning we had breakfast, and he basically outlined the whole plan for the Membership Puzzle project. And this was, I think, in December of 2016, we came together again, and Rob joined me, and we came up with this plan that we are going to co-found the Membership Puzzle project. And part of the goals of the Membership Puzzle project is also to help us understand this market and help us understand how we can launch our membership model here. And we want to be completely dependent on reader revenue as well if we launch here. So all our operating expenses should be covered by readers. So at some point we want to launch with a campaign. We don't know how we're going to do that yet, and the findings from the Membership Puzzle project are going to help us with that. But we're basically going to say one really important thing I think in the whole communication around membership is that we don't say save journalism or help us because we're losing our jobs or the industry is in decline, etc. We only talk about what we try to offer our readers. So what's the value that we offer in their daily lives? And that's probably what we'll focus this campaign also on. But it's going to be a big challenge because in the Netherlands, we went on a show called As the World Turns, which is not a soap opera in the Netherlands, but a daily talk show. And Rob had the privilege of presenting our plans there and was able to reach 10% of the Dutch population. I'm not sure if there's such a show in the US. I'm afraid there's not. So we have to come up with a completely different strategy. And well, that's why we moved here, and Rob and I both live here now. And this is how we're going to spend the rest of 2018.
There are a few things that Day Correspondent has done that seem to me initially sort of counterintuitive. So the idea that in the Netherlands, memberships didn't auto-renew. You asked people, would you like to be a member for another year? And you encouraged them to make a more thoughtful decision. And also the idea that your reporters' jobs look quite different from their peers across the industry. Mm-hmm. So the expectation that they are working much more closely with members of their knowledge community, the idea that 100 doctors, nurses, and patients know more than one healthcare reporter. I'm curious if you can talk just briefly about what that looks like in practice, because sort of the beat-driven approach there is actually quite different from a lot of other newsrooms.
Yeah, so we have 21 full-time reporters, and they all have their specific beat. And could be anything from innovation and education to healthcare, to privatization, to the European Union or progress. So it's a whole different set of beats. And every beat has some sort of mission attached to it. So the correspondent should be able to explain why she is covering that specific topic and what she's trying to find out, and also take a constructive approach. So not just describe the problem, but also figure out together with readers if there's anything we could do about it. And what's key in if you want to involve your readers is that you have to share your story ideas. And that's, I mean, journalism for a long time was publishing a story and then moving on to the next story. That's also for a lot of people the charm in journalism, that you can publish a story and the next day you can think about something completely else. But at the Correspondent, we ask you to share your story idea, and then if you've done that, keep a public notebook, for example, in the form of a weekly personal newsletter, and keep updating your knowledge community about what you're working on. And so it's not that you write a story and then move on. It's you involve your audience in this whole research process that could last as long as years. I mean, there's some people working at the Correspondent who are still working on the same beat. Most of them are, actually. And what's key in this is that we have every Correspondent has two different types of audience. So they have their audience that knows something about the subject, so their knowledge community, and they're writing posts specifically for them. So these posts could only have a couple of thousand readers, but that doesn't matter. It matters that these posts serve as a means to get the knowledge from that community back. So this could be really direct questions, or it could be a question like, I'm reading these 5 books now about this new beat, but tell me what other books I should read. It could also be, tell me about your daily experience that you've seen in your work. The end result of that are articles that go out to their second type of audience, which is everyone else. So even if you don't know a lot about that subject, the articles should still be valuable to you. So that's how it basically works. You keep a public notebook for a knowledge community, and then you push out a more general story to all of our members.
And that idea, I think, of sharing work in progress or ideas can feel very vulnerable. But I'm really encouraged by the transparency inherent in sort of saying, this is what goes into the work, and help us co-publish this.
Yeah.
This is something that we've also seen with City Bureau. I think the idea of demonstrating process and providing public education, that I would love to invite you to talk a little bit more, because I think it's just such a fantastic way of having more inclusive newsrooms.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's maybe doubly important for City Bureau because we started with a critique of the way media was structured. We also know, and in particular as we grow, that we're going to get a critique back from media about how we're structured. And I think the biggest question that these kinds of community-driven and broad-based and participatory journalism production practices, like they raise questions about how accurate is it, what kinds of checks are there. I mean, I think that's the most common is this real journalism? And it's something we sometimes bristle at, but it's understandable because it is built into, like, that is our challenge. So I think making the practices very transparent, and not just like come into a room with us, but here are the steps. Like, is it reproducible? Here's what we used, here's where we went. And even something like documenters, if we're sending somebody to an event and there's a recording that accompanies it, even if something goes terribly wrong with the notes, the evidence to catch that is already right there. And I think we think about that also in our membership program. We, very early, right after we launched it, we had a public newsroom about the membership program itself, where we printed out we looked over the webpage and actually printed it out and asked people who either were members or had been participants in our programming or longtime supporters to mark it up for us, and used that as a prompt for a conversation about what it meant to support this work and be a part of this work. And that was really interesting. I mean, we got a lot out of it. We got good ideas and planned some changes. It was also very affirming, I think, on both sides to realize to hear your audience, your community think through the same problems that you are was very, very helpful. And I think more and more we think about that as our project. Like it occurred to me while we were all talking just now that I think membership is often framed as a revenue solution, and the idea is that it is a way to pay for quality journalism that the world needs. I think more and more we're starting to think about it in the other direction, that we need funding in order to produce quality journalism so that we can cultivate a community of informed and engaged citizens. So in a real way, I think we, in some ways, produce journalism in order to have members Yeah.
I think it's terrifically important, and that idea that we've been sort of sketching out alongside City Bureau and other newsrooms in real time is, what does it look like to pay in participation? Instead of the first ask being, hand over your credit card information, what a different way to say, come help fact check this with us. It seems very encouraging. And a lot of what you talked about reproducibility suggests some of what Sue was sharing about good investigative journalism practice. And I think it's worth noting that no one on this stage came up with membership. Membership is something in media that has long existed and has a very rich history, but we're especially excited that at this time it's having a real fascination and a real moment that we're eager to see continue. I'm curious of other stories, sort of what you've seen work well, either Kate and Sue, within your own organizations or other newsrooms that you admire vis-a-vis membership.
I think from the Intercept's perspective, one of the challenges with us about showing work in progress is a lot of the stories that we publish are based on things that are not yet public knowledge. So that is one area that we don't show that much work in progress, because either we're keeping it off the nets completely, or we are, in other ways, trying to make sure that as when we publish it, that's potentially the first time it's coming out into the world. That said, in order for that information to come to us, we have to be very open about encouraging people to leak and blow whistles, and for encouraging our journalists to develop both those kind of deep source relationships, as well as taking it seriously when people send us a blind message, or when people leak to us something that looks batshit insane on via secure drop. Don't get me wrong; there are plenty of false flags that come through there, and things that are mockable or things that should be passed along. But there's so much out here in the world that we wouldn't know if we had dismissed every crackpot idea as not being worth following. So the Intercept may not have open notebooks where we show a lot of our work, but we do have our journalists have a deep relationship with the communities that they cover, and specifically with those experts in those communities that they cover, that people are willing to come to them because they trust that this is information that we are going to get out into the world that is of the public interest, that we're willing to get out into the world and frame in such a way such that we can hold those in power to account, whether it's in the government or now more and more in private industry. One of the interesting things for me about our membership program has been how to encourage people, or how to make it clear that I want you to support, or people join us because they want to be part of what we're doing. They want to give us money, but they also want to do more. Whether that is offering to translate for us, whether that is offering to advocate for us. Someone invited me to his house to run a fundraiser in Vancouver. It's amazing kind of the doors that are opening. And in some ways, well, in fact, actually my favorite is the woman in South America who runs she runs like boat tours along this protected river preserve, and I can't remember the country. But she said, hey, I'll comp a whole bunch of tours if you want. And I said, okay, no. She goes, I barely break even, but I said, no, we'll pay you for tours if we do this. But people care so much about what we do that in some ways it's figuring out how to take advantage where we can. So the same way that we have to sift through all of the noise that comes into us as story leads or as story opportunities, we have the same kind of largesse and opportunities on the membership front. And we've been trying to figure out the ways that are the most valuable for us to spend some time with and really invest back into that community with a pretty small staff to try to take that on. So I think that's been some of our challenges as we've been, or some of our, I don't think it's not a unique challenge to us, but certainly a very interesting challenge as we look to build this.
I'll mention two things that I think illustrate some of the things happening in media around the membership space. The first is the Aspen Journal, which is a small nonprofit. It distributes entirely through a newspaper, a print and digital newspaper, commercial paper. And they did really well with their end-of-year fundraising, and it was a membership-type drive, and it was the first that they had ever done. And when I talked to them, what stands out to me about this, I was surprised they did that well because it was their first time out and because most people aren't coming directly to them. And so in this world, like your chart where everybody's distributing, I talked to them for a long time about it, and they have been able to build up a distinct brand. So their story comes through, even though they're published by another publication. They do have unique branding. They focus their coverage in just a couple of areas. Everyone knows that they cover water issues, which in the West are huge. And so the public turned out for them and seems to recognize that they produce a kind of coverage that otherwise the newspaper wouldn't have. And there was support around that. And I think that's significant because I think we're going to continue to see a mix of people building direct audience and building audience through other media and other channels. So I think watching what happens with that and like the branding and how do you carry your story with your story so that the public realizes what you do is a really interesting thing to watch. The other thing I'll just tell you about has been one of my favorite things in the last month, and it comes out of citizen journalism. We have a member that's very unusual for INN in that most of our members are longtime professionals. And this organization is Citizen Journalism in East Lansing, Michigan. They just get volunteers in the community. They train them to be reporters. They start them on easy stories. And as they get better and better, they move up to bigger and bigger stories. And so they're covering this community that otherwise had no coverage. But they ran into a First Amendment issue. And they hadn't dealt with FOIA appeals and all that. And so they went on the listserv, and I kind of held my breath because we have a lot of hard-bitten, tough investigators. And I thought, oh my God, are they going to, is my phone going to ring? Like, why is this a member? And all the investigative journalists piled in and were like, no, file this, go tell them that. And there was like this whole scrum around fighting this First Amendment thing, which I don't think the citizen journalists ever started out thinking they would be having that kind of fight in this little town. And so what's interesting about that and ties it back to this is that you're seeing these forms and approaches merge around how you engage the community. And in that case, that's another publication. They are funded entirely by the community. They don't have any grants. They're just funded by people in the town who contribute. They both volunteer and give their time, but and it's growing from a little thing into something now becoming significant and taking on these challenges. So I think that level of community support is really significant.
It's a great example. Thank you for that. My last question for this group, what keeps you up at night? What is the thing that you're currently thinking through? Just a softball question.
How many you want?
What is the number one thing that you are eager to figure out a solution for on behalf of the people you serve with your journalism?
Thank you so much. So I'm supposed to answer now, right? Yeah. So one of the hardest thing for us is so we're lucky to have a group of 21 really good journalists who use all these new methods that we're developing, but it's also really hard to find new journalists who want to work with this model. So whenever Rob is interviewing a new journalist and the person says about the whole audience engagement and seeing your readers as sources, that sounds like a lot of extra work. That's a red flag for us because it is your work. It's just a different way of finding sources. It's not the classic Rolodex, which we also have, but it's an extension to that. And or another remark is, but won't people steal my story ideas? Well, I think you can share your story idea and then win a Pulitzer with it, as David Fahrenthold proved of the Washington Post, who basically put all his all his research questions and progress out there. And because he did that, he found a big group of readers who helped him with his research into Trump's philanthropy efforts. So really finding people who we can expand with. That's one of the big challenges. And also running a startup is terrible. Don't do it.
Welcome to America. Talent pipeline, though, I think is an important thing to flag. Kate?
I feel extremely, when I was interviewing with First Look, my second round interview was the day before the election last year. I sent a fruit basket to the newsroom because I knew there was no way anyone was going to read a thank you note. When I woke up on the morning after the election, my husband works for the federal government, let's put it this way. So he went to work this morning not knowing if he was actually going to be doing orderly shutdown activities or working. But he expressed a certain existential angst. He said, what am I doing? He'd been there this is now his third administration. He went into work frustrated, not sure what the world was going to look like. And I said, that new job just got a lot more interesting for me. The thing that keeps me up at night is is that 80% of the Intercept audience that said, if this didn't exist, I wouldn't be able to find it anywhere else. My responsibility of helping build this sustainable model for what we're doing here at First Look is a requirement for the organization and the kind of journalism that we both we do every day, and that we want to support in the world. So the responsibility of finding that sustainable model, of which membership is a huge part of, knowing, are we on the right path? Are we on the path for this kind of independence? How many more business models are we going to have to cycle through? Is the world going to change enough? Is this a fad? Was this a Trump bump? Are we moving? Will platforms disrupt us again? And next year we'll all be getting our news through our shoes. And Tom's Shoe Company is going to be the future of journalism. Knowing that what we do is so important, and the work that hopefully everyone here in this community of practice is doing to help keep it independent and sustainable, and the fear both of failure and the opportunities of success, that's what keeps me up at night.
I think that's the actual mic drop.
Yeah, fair enough. I think what keeps me up is a similar thing, a sense of urgency. I don't worry tremendously about national news, and I don't worry tremendously about global news. There are shortages in global, but we have so much more access through translation and seeing publications. I do worry in the United States, we are a republic, and so most of the government that touches your life is not in DC. It's in the states, it's at the county level, which are virtually uncovered anymore, and in many cities. And we're in a time when courts are changing rapidly, our government is changing rapidly, secrecy is growing very rapidly. So this work in building this community supportive journalism, can we do it fast enough and broadly enough to have people out there who are our eyes and ears at many levels across the US? And I do think there is a sense of urgency around that.
Issues of scale and again, I think that the talent idea comes through there. Harry.
I think of two practical questions that we are asking right now that I think kind of build up to a bigger idea that sometimes keeps me up at night. One is just how we communicate about this membership program, especially because it overlaps in sometimes interesting and sometimes confusing ways with our programs. We definitely need something better than bronze, silver, and gold if anybody has ideas. And the second and related question is, like, what kinds of access, if any, we're offering to members that we're not offering to the public? Because so far, everything that we have done has either been free to the public or we're paying the public to do it. And at the same time, we do want to value and, to some extent, pitch to people this idea of not exclusivity, but more direct and intimate participation in the process. And that's come up in a concrete way with like events. So we have this public newsroom series, and we love how kind of loose it is sometimes, and how like just real it feels, and we keep it lo-fi on purpose. And we also feel like we could have some capacity to do some more orchestrated, maybe kind of interviews, and that we may have too many people and we may need to ticket, and at that point would we start thinking about letting in supporters and in a way that we're not letting in the public. And so we're having to be creative around that. And one example is if we ever did have like if we got Rom to go live on air on the record with us, we might let members in and then broadcast the whole thing so that everybody could hear it. That felt like a compromise that we probably could make as long as the product of it is accessible to everyone. Those two things together, the piece that keeps me up at night is the possibility that our membership as it develops will not look like the communities that we serve and will not look like the people who participate in our programming. Because so far that is the thing. If we were to like close up shop today, that would still be our best accomplishment, is that we've built real relationships that did not exist before and would not otherwise exist in heavily segregated and divided neighborhoods in Chicago. And I think we want to keep that at all costs, but I think it might get tougher as we build up a kind of new public model that, isn't always built for that.
Right. And the reference there is Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. So the idea that if you had some sort of live journalism that was almost Q&A or an interview with a high-profile public figure, you could find out a way that there's a member benefit, but then there's also public access to that.
Sure.
To that coverage. Excellent. Yeah. I'm a little worried about the lack of sleep amongst this crew. There's a lot of really meaty considerations there, and I very much appreciate you sharing. What questions do you all have? I see one in the back. There was a hand that shot up.
Thank you very much. Very exciting to listen to you talk about this. I myself have been involved for several decades in the innards of financing community broadcasting. So I'm curious, how much sustainability do you see in what you're actually doing? How many people, for example, we have had systems where people pledge monthly out of their bank accounts, and it goes up and down. And all I can say is sometimes it goes a lot way down. So and also the question of collaboration between everybody. Because you look at NPR, there's a great need to have an alternative to NPR in the country, a different kind of morning show, if you will. How are people cooperating with each other on that one?
So it sounds like almost a two-part question around collaboration, and also what is the long-term funding revenue or confidence around that? Well, what do you really think is going to happen? It can fall off like a heartbeat.
I mean, let me speak. So I spent, for transparency, I spent 8 years at NPR, and I have a complete agreement with everything that we just heard in that question about the importance of having competitors, especially, and different voices out there in the world. Honestly, mainly in many ways because of what we heard how we heard Harry position City Bureau, making sure that we have making sure we have a diverse number of voices and perspectives on the air, and supporting the journalism that we do. I think that my organization collaborates, the Intercept and First Look Media, our core competency is not collaboration. I will admit that. We have collaborations, we do a number of collaborations, but there's many more organizations, specifically in Sue's world, that have spent a lot more time building up collaboration as part of their DNA. But I think that it is critical for journalism, and specifically for sustainability of journalism, for all of us to collaborate. The question about long-term sustainability, my hope is as we change the conversation about what membership is, beyond just, what is it? Julie, you might know off the top of your head, but 5%, so like 2% of the public media audience funds the, less than that? Yeah, it's something, but it's some small percentage of the audience is providing that kind of member support. The goal that I would have is we expand the definition of membership to be a little bit more the way that Des Correspondant looks at that, and really try to broaden out the number of people that are supporting us or investing in us in some way in order to overcome the kind of up and down experience that you've had as a community broadcaster.
Yeah. I think it's unknown how far and how sustainable the support will be, but I think the markers are promising. In the area of nonprofit news outside of public media, that's gone, when INN was formed in 2009, it was a consortium of 27 organizations, and that was pretty much all there were, and they were very similar. And so now it's at 150 and climbing rapidly. So there's a momentum there, and the growth has been steady, and communities are still supporting those. Some are very, very fragile. Others are quite robust. And so I think we're in the middle of a cultural shift in people thinking about news in a different way, just as we're talking about journalists thinking of readers and members in a different way, also the public thinking of news as it's part of their civic fabric and something they invest in their communities. And that is a cultural shift we're probably in the early years of, and we'll have to see how that plays out. It's been generations. News has been essentially free here for generations. So people didn't think about it. They just assumed it would be there. And, you know, we'll see how that develops.
Yeah, and I want to just put a plug in here for our Shorenstein project with a cohort of single-subject news organizations trying to figure out what revenue sustainability looks like. And I think to Sue's point, it's really interesting. There's a part of that research that's about what does it take to build that model into an organization. And then the really interesting part is how do you actually sustain it? And we're hoping to provide some answers to that as well over time.
There was a question.
Sorry. Okay. All right, over here.
Yeah. Hello. So I just wanted to know if there are any unique and creative ways of using social media to build your membership program. I mean, is there scope to do that, and have there been any experiments to do that as well at either of these organizations?
So the way we use social media in general is we use it to, basically we ask our members to use social media to promote us. So when the crowdfunding succeeded, I remember that we had to decide, we had to make a lot of decisions. All of a sudden we're like, oh, now we really have to do this. And one of the things we were talking about was a paywall. Do we want a paywall? And we came up with an experiment, and after 5 years, we think it's the way to go, which is telling our members, if you like an article, just feel free to share it with anyone, because you're the one who paid for it, you made it possible, and also you're as a human being, you want to share things that you find interesting. So let's not fight that urge. And also for a journalist, it's the same story. If you've discovered something, you want as many people as possible to read it. So every journalist hates paywalls. So maybe there's something wrong with paywalls. So we came up with this idea that you can just share the link, and if someone who's not a member clicks on that link, she sees just the article, no comments. You can only comment if you're a member. You can navigate to another page. Of course, you can navigate to the subscribe page, but you can navigate to other pages. And in the top, it says, this article has been given to you by paying member X. So it shows that someone paid for it. And this has been our biggest driver of member growth, basically asking our members, please use your social media to spread the word. So we weren't that shocked by the recent Facebook changes, because we are already dependent on our members sharing our articles, and not so much from our own page.
I love that example, and just to add another data point to that, I think that's an interesting use of social media. What we've seen in early findings from our Shorenstein cohort is that leads that come in from social media tend to be of lower quality. So we're now running some experiments around, actually proving that out and under what conditions you can actually get high quality donor member leads. But so far they seem like kind of crap.
One thing to add to that, when we launched our initial membership campaign for the Intercept, we had a relatively low conversion on social as compared to our email list. This didn't surprise us, but that was sort of putting out the same message in emails on social and on the email list didn't quite seem to have the same conversion. When we launched our Intercepted membership campaign a few months later for the podcast, a few weeks prior to the podcast, we had launched a Facebook group of Intercepted members or Intercepted listeners. One of the things that we found there was what sort of surprised us from a social perspective. It was a self-sustaining group from the start. We had the core, and we didn't have an email list specifically for the podcast. So we had a group of people who were already interested in engaging and talking about this particular segment of our coverage. And we found that we had, not surprisingly, had a much more successful membership campaign because we had that core group of people who were already, we were able to reach them in that group, in that community, and that's where we've also had, sorry to the tote bag people sharing pictures of their hoodies and their stickers that we sent them as well. So.
Hi, I'm Simon Galperin. I'm an engagement advocate at Ground Source and the director of the Community Information Cooperative. My question is, and it might be a little meta, so I apologize, if reader revenue is something that's going to sustain organizations for more than a few years, if it's going to be a meaningful part of the journalism business, does wealth inequality become an issue that journalism needs to begin to tackle? As wealth inequality increases, the opportunity for these readers to contribute in any meaningful way also decreases. It decreases as wealth inequality increases. So how does the mission of a journalism organization change to begin to address that?
That's a great question.
This should have been my answer for what keeps me up at night. So thank you for asking this. So that's something we're really putting a lot of thought in right now, because so all of our articles are free. You can read those. But if you want to participate, if you want to leave comments and be part of the community, you have to pay 60 euros. So now we're trying to come up with ways that we can, in the US, can make it more accessible to a bigger group. Because we talked to some journalists here who we'd love to work with, and they said, if you're going to charge the same amount here, you're going to exclude my whole readership. So maybe it's something in the lines of pay what you can. Maybe it's along the lines that the New York Times recently did, that they let other people pay for students. But this is, I don't have an answer to this. This is really one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now.
Yeah, and I think there's a worry that, we were talking about critiques of public media, as their funder base has gotten older and wealthier, that it tends to skew the coverage and the kinds of voices you hear and the kinds of topics you cover. So it's not just an access issue then, it also becomes like, how does it influence the coverage?
One thing, I guess a model from the subscription world that I'm encouraged by is what the New York Times has done with student gift subscriptions. So I will be encouraged to see more models of underwriting the work so that more people can enjoy the benefits of full participation. And I've been surprised to the extent in our research that, I guess I had gone into it expecting that people who choose to pay for news would feel a sense of bitterness, the idea of I pay for something and other people are able to access it for free. And in fact, what we hear is a much more altruistic point of view, which is I want a more informed community that I live in, where I can talk about these stories with my students, with my family members. Maybe there is a limit on that, but I've been very impressed by how willing people are to pay for something they don't have to do to access it.
Other questions? Yeah, Andrea?
Oh, there's
I
one
could
more.
take that.
Oh, sorry.
I think
Another comment? Go ahead.
I think that's a really fascinating question, and one that I had not actually really thought of, is like what kind of economy and economic model is implied by a membership model, because it's also the case that the advertising model, which worked to an extent, it did what it did consistently for a while, also implied a relationship that journalists and journalism had to the broader economy and like how we pay for this. I just had two thoughts. Like one, I think you were kind of asking in terms of coverage, like should we be looking at wealth inequality as a real issue in which journalism itself and journalism institutions have a real stake if this is the funding model? I think we also, if we want to think about the coverage, also need to start with ourselves and think about the class dynamics and composition of newsrooms and journalism. I think it's one of the most important and least talked about ironies of the economic crisis in journalism, that as the crisis has gotten worse and worse, the profession has become more and more prestigious and more expensive to get into, and that has real costs to the public. The other piece, and this might be like a route into that, is when we talk about sustainability in journalism, we almost always talk about revenue. And that is only one side of the equation. The other side is production. It's how, if you take the same amount of resources, how much can you do with it? And I think about these, one feature of these more broad-based participatory journalism practices is that they are lean. You can do a lot more if you involve a lot of people and if you lower the barriers to entry to participate in this. So I think we should take that seriously. Sue mentioned the volunteer-run organization in Michigan. We have a very close partner in Chicago, the Southside Weekly, which is entirely staffed by volunteers. I think it's like one of the great best kept secrets in these journalism conversations. And I know I was involved also. That entire paper costs less to run in a year than one journalist makes at the Chicago Tribune. And it doesn't mean that we don't also need very talented, professional, hard-hitting reporters. It's just, I don't think that's the full picture. And I think membership also could go hand in hand with that conversation.
Oh, sorry. I have go ahead.
I was just one follow-up point. Is one thing I hear from a lot of members is that there's the reader revenue funnel, but there is a supporter funnel that isn't entirely overlapping. There's a kind of separate supporter funnel of people who donate or sign up for membership who aren't regular readers. Right. I don't have any data on that, but I hear it quite often on that. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries. I just have a bit of a related question. Some of the examples you've shared are great examples of how membership can support really meaningful work. I'm just curious, thinking about the concern of also making sure that there's shared community spheres and shared public spheres. Is it possible to apply some of these membership concepts to legacy outlets to reach people where they're at already, and think about not just some of the more prestige outlets that often get funded by membership support?
I think it's a fantastically important question, and one where a lot more research is needed. I mean, Edwin, I would encourage you to pipe up here. Also, in regards to print publications and legacy print sites, and I just think it's an important consideration that, frankly, was not the purview of this report, but is well worth bringing up in this context.
Yeah, I work with two legacy print magazines that are 49 and 69 years old. And of course, our subscribers are at a fulfillment house in California or Iowa. There's no way to integrate legacy print subscribers with, your website. So what happens with the legacy print publications, and I know a lot of them are now in really serious problem. They're really in serious trouble. A lot of, because they find that their donation system is one thing, their print subscription is another thing, their email newsletter may be Constant Contact, and their login system is Discus. And they end up with 4 systems that don't even talk to each other. So trying to build a coherent, integrated membership system is a pipe dream for a lot of, older magazines.
Yeah, that's a great point. So some of the barriers may be technical and operational as much as they are strategic. Okay, let's see what else we got here.
Thanks.
Hi, Liz Worthington from the American Press Institute. This has been fantastic. Thank you. I really liked the idea, Kate, that you brought up of people who join also want to do more, whether that's fundraise or translate or participate in some way. I'm wondering, how do you communicate that out to people? Is it just they've just told you and you give them an opportunity, or even with some of the other publications, how could newsrooms take advice from that and try to do that with their own audiences?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found, both from my experience at the Intercept and sort of watching the communications come in from our membership program, and also many years ago when I used to answer the phone at NPR and at other places, was that that outpouring of wanting to do more is a natural part of the core of that audience. So people that care and identify with the media want to share it. They want to advocate. They want to translate it. The bigger challenge that I have is not identifying places in the audience that people want to do that, but how to actually harness that. Because everything that we've heard today about the membership program being really a whole newsroom effort and requiring a lot of effort, everything from evaluating a donated Alexa skill to, I remember when I was at NPR, one of the stories we used to tell was the Jeff, he's going to kill me for forgetting his last name, but the kid who created the Facebook page and who tried to get it, who got a couple 100,000 followers and then donated it back to us. There are people out there. The concern is systems to better take advantage of that. And I think that's why things like Ground Source or Harken or other tools that are out there to better direct some of that user and that audience desire to participate, I think are having a moment right now, because they tap into that energy and give it to the newsroom in something that is usable and potentially scalable. And I think there's other opportunities for that, whether that is in broad-based fact-checking or translations or advocacy for news organizations that may walk right up to the line of advocating for a change in policy. Where do you then take your audience that probably cares about that change in policy, and how do they then take that to the next step?
Yeah, that's what we've seen is, so our journalists ask for help every time they start a series. So that really helps that our membership know that we want their help. And it's not just by leaving comments, but also by actually helping out. And the kind of stories that works best with are constructive stories. So for example, we had a recent project about debt, personal debt, because a lot of people in the Netherlands suffer from debt, and we wanted to do something. The journalists wanted to do something about it, and a lawyer, for example, joined in. He worked pro bono for us, and a lobbyist joined in. She worked pro bono for us, and together they came up with this whole campaign based on journalism, based on research, for the government to handle debt better, and was discussed in the parliament last week, and they're now taking some cues from us in actual law. I could mention a couple of other examples, like sustainability. Our correspondent, energy, wanted to research how companies can become more sustainable. So he said, we as the correspondent want to become more sustainable. Help us out. And a lot of, from solar panel experts to corporate sustainability experts, they all helped us for free without us mentioning their company name. So there wasn't like this marketing spin for them. It was just completely out of that they wanted to help. So being open to it and letting your journalists being open to it and letting them ask it on your main platform really helped us.
So we are about at our time, but we're going to take one more question.
Thank you. I'll be short. Going back to Simon's question about the exchange of value that you have between your members, has anybody considered non-monetary membership in exchange for activities or putting together a document or helping to edit something like that? Can you discuss some of the methods that you've explored or experimented with?
I could talk about that one. It's a little tough for us because I feel like non-monetary membership is what we were doing before we launched a membership program, and so the reason we launched a membership program was to do. So I could talk more about what we do in general, but I don't know. I guess also the point there is it being clear about what the relationship is and is not is both, I think, important and also something that we're still figuring out and dealing with and figuring out how to have different kinds of very clear relationships with people who are interacting and participating and producing and partaking of the work. One thing that might be related, it was also sort of from the previous question, just like a concrete way to be open to collaborations. We have a coffee shop across from the hall from our newsroom, and it kind of started, it was like a former partner who started it, and we've since joked that we don't ever want to have a newsroom again that doesn't have a coffee shop attached. But we're kind of serious because it's kind of amazing to think about how much having that space where you could just invite somebody in makes it possible to follow through on some of those offers of help. And I think it also has a lot to do with how we think about those different relationships, because one of them is that it's like, come on over, we're down the block.
One model that I'm eager to see drawn out here is a membership continuum in which staff within an organization represent the most extreme, sort of the richest form of membership, and people who give either financially or with their time, tips, ideas, sources also are part of that continuum, whether they actually contribute monetarily or not. I'm really eager to see sort of the idea of a richer understanding of what we talk about when we talk about membership. And one example that is worth bringing up here is What the Fuck Just Happened Today, which is a Trump News Today newsletter that if you're not following, it's just a fascinating example of Matt Kaiser, who's a one-man show, saying, I could really use your help. And now people commit code and moderate comments for him. One of his members said, this is great work. It should be a podcast. I'll produce it. I mean,
do you know that?
Yay! We have actually never met, and this is excellent. Thank you for your great question. This was
no one has ever quoted me back to me before.
That was not a plant, everyone. I quickly just wanted to mention that Elizabeth and I have made the glossary and the resources chapters of the guide open and editable, and we want these to be living documents, so please do contribute to them. I want to acknowledge the amazing staff here at Tau, Leon Postma with Day Correspondent, who designed our fantastic cover, Jay Rosen, our project director, and Gonzalo. Gonzalo, can I just ask you to stand up? Yeah. Without this gentleman, this never would have happened. And of course to Elizabeth. It's been such a joy to collaborate with you.
Ditto. So with that, we will continue the conversation. Please stay. We have food and drinks in the back. Thank you all for being here this evening.
Oh, funders. Funders. Okay. They're on the cover.